In this video, we will see a lot of examples about the knight versus bishop endgames. Our journey begins with good knight versus bad bishop, as white plays Mikhail Botvinnik against Tigran Petrosyan, and it is not so obvious why this knight is preferable than the enemy's bishop. One thing is clear, that the d4 pawn is hanging. If you look at the material count, it's 4 versus 4, but we see clearly that this knight is not that much superior at the moment compared to the bishop. Also, this rook is standing much better than the rook. But white goes with the strong move knight to c5. It is important to understand that because black has the pawn standing on the same color as the bishop in the center, it makes this bishop as an awful piece. After knight c5, black responds with a logical strong move bishop to f5. Keeping the bishop active. Right now, this knight is standing really well on c5, but is not threatening anything. The rook is tied down to the defense. It's really forced to protect the d4 and a2 pawns. But what white can do is to activate the third piece, king g3. The idea is to go on f4 and e5, and because black's king is extremely passive and can't get there on time, if white manages to go on e5 square first, how is black going to defend the d5 pawn? It will be possible to achieve that. Therefore, after bishop f5, king g3, black tries to create a counterplay by pushing the pawn forward, a4. King jumps on a4, a3, and king e5. It is important to notice that black is not just pushing the pawn randomly, they have a great idea. After realizing that the d5 pawn will be gone very soon without any protection, black tries to get a counterplay along this a2 pawn and on the b file. So after playing rook b4, the threat is to play rook b2. If white plays carelessly and grabs the pawn on d5, there is rook b2. It's not easy to answer to these questions. If you take it, black promotes the pawn on b1, and in case of knight b3, which looks like a logical option in the beginning, there's bishop b1. This pawn will be gone on a2, and I assume the b pawn will get promoted very soon as well. Therefore here, after realizing that black's biggest threat is to go to rook b2, white plays a strong move knight d3. White doesn't mind trading off this knight into the bishop because after this king being extremely active and black having these two weak pawns, it's easy to guess that white is going to win the game without a lot of trouble. So black goes with rook b5 after realizing that there is no rook b1, a1, whatever, because this pawn easily will be protected, plus the d5 pawn is hanging, black just calls it a day and plays rook b5. King d6. And instead of moving the knight away, which will be a complete disaster trying to get the d5 pawn because of rook b2 again, the rook cannot get moved, king jumps on d6. It's really funny seeing this king being that active, but well, it works, so why not? The threat is to go for king c6, undermining this rook. If the rook stays along the a5th rank, there will be king b6 and this rook will be just leaving the b file. And if the rook stays along the b file, in that scenario, the d5 pawn will be gone. So black goes with king f7, king to c6, and the rook is under attack. Black decides to go for this rook endgame, because if the rook goes on a5 square, there will be even king b6. White can also go with knight f4, because there is no longer this rook b2 threat. Because of extremely active king, white can easily win the game. So after king c6, bishop takes d3 was played, rook takes back, rook b2 followed by rook a3. White has got an extra pawn, and it wasn't too difficult to convert it. Basically, white just pushed the pawn all the way till the end, making sure that the h3 pawn is not coming. And at the end of the game, white was faster to promote the d pawn into the queen. Let's have a look at another fascinating example played between Rosselli del Turco Stefano against Akiba Rubinstein. Rubinstein was very famous for playing extremely well in the endgames. Here we see bishop versus knight, and it is very obvious even on the first glance to understand that this bishop is significantly worse compared to its counterpart on f5 standing there, which is very logical because the pawn is standing on the same color in the center as the bishop. This is really a bad sign. So now black starts with rook h1 and after playing king e2. I firmly believe that rook e1 also would have led to winning endgame, but black decided to keep the rooks on the board, which is understandable because after playing rook g1, this rook is significantly stronger than its counterpart on g1, and clearly f5 knight is just dominating on the board. Knight h4, hitting the pawn on h2, white responds with g3 and going back on f5. It is important in these scenarios to create as many weaknesses as possible. Now, as you can see, this rook is tied down to the pawn on g3, because if the rook moves, there will be knight g3. Also, f3 square is weakened, e4 as well. So just step by step, black needs to make an improvement. b3, there's not a single thing white can do. They can't even move the c3 bishop away, because d4 pawn will be gone. This king also in Zugzwang can go on d3 because of rook f2. So white goes with b3, king e6, bishop b2, to have some kind of room for the king. Black goes with a6, bishop c3, knight d6. In these situations, it is important to understand that if your piece is standing really well, for instance, the knight on f5, it's not like the final destination of the piece. You might be able to maneuver it. Sometimes you need to go on a different square. So it's not like you go on f5 and it's 0-1 standing on spot. Not like that. Maneuver it whenever you have to. So knight goes to d6, jumping on e4 square, which will attack the bishop, and on f2, and it will create even more problems for white. So after king e3, knight e4, bishop goes to e1, and the king goes to f5. Rook f1, followed by rook h8. Right now, white sort of threatens to go for f3, but whenever these trades will be happening, this king will also join into the action on g4. So it's not like white is getting much out of it. Black goes with rook h8, beautiful move, tries to maneuver the rook along on another file to get the access to the c2 or c1, because if this rook gets to the queen side, the pawns will be vulnerable there, and a2 and b3 will be lost after one on another. So king d3, b5 was played, a4, and even rook h7, sort of waiting moves right now, and rook c8 was already played. White decided to stay for some time. They moved the pieces back and forth. I don't want you to focus too much about it, because it typically happens that you might not be able to find the direct winning blow. So you just have to sort of like move around the pieces. The same thing happened. And after a couple of moves, black realized that it was time to push the pawn on f4, because black couldn't really do much along the c file. White put up a very good resistance on it. So now it's time to bring all the pieces into the action. Black's biggest problem was that the king was not really included into the attack, but now is no longer the case. After f4, rook h7, knight takes d2. You might be wondering why not something like king f5. This would have allowed white at some point to free up the rook, which is not really the great thing to do. So now rook goes on h7. Also, in case of king f5, there might have been f3, and if there will be less pawns on the board, it will decrease the chances for black to push for win. So rook h7 with the intention that after f3 there will be rook h3. So you always have to pay attention to every little detail, because there might be a way that you're allowing your opponent to escape from the pressure. Bishop d2, knight takes d2, because here black already realized that because of their extremely active rook plus the king in the combination on g6, it would have been very easy to win the game. White goes for f3, tries to create the mayhem here, but because the black's king is extremely active, it's just impossible to avoid all the threats. Rook e1 is coming, king g3 also will be coming in the future, so f5 was played. You might be surprised why not something like rook capturing on f3, which looks like a logical option on the first glance, but here black has actually many different ways how they can win the game. It's not only one. One of the easiest would be to go for rook to a1. All these pawns will be lost after one another, and the problem is that the threat is rook a3. If the rook goes back on f2, there is rook a3 check, king comes here, and because of active king, black can win with a couple of ways. Of course, they can capture the pawn, but of course, b takes a4 is much faster, and white is not even on time to stop the pawn. Therefore, in this case, white can't even do that, and after these trades happened, f5 was the only way what they could do. Rook went on e4. In case of f6, there is rook f4 coming in the future. King g3 is coming next. And of course, it is impossible to save this game anymore. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, because whenever we reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway, the video courses from my website. Anatoly Karpov against Polgar Zhuzha. Bishop versus knight. This is a clear demonstration why the bishop is preferable compared to knight in these cases. First of all, if you get the positions like that you can actually attack on almost all the flanks, queen side, center, king side, and so on, bishop tends to be a better piece. In more closed positions, of course, the knight will be preferable. This is a good practical example to understand what we need to do first. So when you're having the bishop, it is not really important to put it on some special outpost, unlike the knight, which really belongs there. Otherwise, standing on the back rank like on b8, c8, or something like that will not be working. So right now, you can actually keep the bishop on f1, which is doing an amazing job right now, keeping this whole pawn structure fixed, that black cannot even push b4 or a5 or something like that. First of all, we want to activate the king and go in the center. Black goes king e7. Because black has sort of like a fortress right now, it's impossible to activate the king. White has to do something more than that and goes for a4, attacking the pawn on b5. Black cannot go for b4 because there will be bishop a6. And in case of b takes a4, there is bishop a6 with the intention of playing bishop b5, attacking the knight and the pawn. And if black is forced to go for knight to a7, there is bishop d3 followed by c2. And guess what? This pawn will be gone in very short order. That's why here black tries to stay more or less stable and goes for knight a7. This is a very sad move, but black can't do anything else. A takes b5 followed by a takes b5. In case of knight b5, there is these pawn takes here and king e5. We're already getting to the pawn ending where the active king plays a decisive role and brings back the victory for white. A takes b5 and now playing f4. It is important to know that after king d4 there is king d6. We can't do much. If king e5 there is knight c6 check, and then the knight will be going backwards. And it's also very important to not push the pawn on b4 in these cases, thinking that you would fix the pawn on b5. Yes, it does fix the pawn, but there is knight c6. If more pawns will get traded, it will benefit the weaker side. Therefore, keep the pawns on the board and don't make this kind of decision. White goes for f4. If you see that black has one weakness, you are maintaining pressure to it, but black defends it relatively well, it is essential to create the second weakness. About this matter, the principle of two weaknesses, we will be seeing it in the future, so stay tuned and check out this video series. White goes for f4, tries to open up even more files so they can navigate to the king side, go towards the queen side whenever it is required. Black responds with king to d6 and white goes with bishop d3. Funny fact, white played bishop d3. They moved the bishop first time after a very long waiting time. If you'll even see the game, if I'm not mistaken, they haven't moved the bishop for like 22 moves or so. It was standing on f1 and white managed to win the game. So bishop d3, king goes to d7, bishop e2, king d6, and bishop goes back to f1. You might be surprised why black is not pushing this b4, because in this case, the king easily gets the access to the b4 pawn, and because the pawn is not standing on b5, controlling the c4 outpost, if it's on b4, it's very easy for white to win an extra pawn. So black goes for king d7, king d8, king d6, d7. So white pushes the pawn on f5, tries to open up the files as soon as possible, king d6, pawn takes, king takes, and very important move, bishop h3 check. Black is in big trouble right now. They can't stand on f6 or e7 or anything like that because there is king d5. And guess what? This knight is even trapped. Can't go on c8, c6 is under control. In case of b4, all these squares are covered and king b6, a7, white wins the game. So here black realized that it was more important to stay closer to the knight, which allows white to bring the king on more active square. King f5, g5 was played, just in case king e7 doesn't work, trying to go for king g6, king f8, because there's king e5, d5, c5, and this pawn will be gone very easily. So king, here in this position, black goes for g5, and they think that, okay, they gave out the pawn because they can keep the king stuck on h6, and will it be enough to make a draw? Obviously not. Bishop d7 comes next. This knight is simply trapped, and after king e7, of course white had many other ways, but it was enough to take on b5, knight b5, and king g5. This knight equals to the pawn because it always needs to stay there to stop this pawn, and these two pawns, of course, will be outplaying only the king alone. So just pushes the pawn forwards, b4, knight is busy stopping this, and of course knight cannot stop these pawns together. Even the bishop cannot stop it, so knight of course has worse chances to make it happen. That's how white easily managed to win the game. Let's have a look at another amazing example. This is the game between Boris Spassky against Robert James Fischer. White has a big advantage. Bishop is preferable when you can play on all the flanks compared to the knight on a5, which is not really doing much. Plus, white has a chance to create a pass pawn on the king side by pushing the pawns forward, which is a huge benefit. So white starts with h4, tries to create some problems, activating the king and getting to f4 square. Of course, here you might think that how about g4 to go with g5 picks enemy's king to this weak pawn on g6, but after g4 it's not so easy to understand, because if these pawns will get traded, black has a chance to sort of create some kind of fortresses and stabilize the position. Of course, it will be still difficult, but in any case, white goes with king e3. Strong move. Black responds with g5. Black can't really stand here for a long time, because after playing g4, if not g5, g5 will be coming. And if black responds with g5, there will be h5, protected pass pawn, which causes a lot of trouble. Black goes for g5 in any case, because this pawn is weakened on g6, and we go with h5. This pawn is too powerful that it requires the attention either from the knight or enemy's king, which is enough to convert the game into the victory. Knight h6, king d3. So whenever you created the weakness on the king side and this knight is just horribly placed on h6 trying to stop the pawn, it is important to not only focus on that flank and try to put the king magically on h7 or whatever. You can open the horizon to another flank, such as playing king d3 followed by king c4, which actually leads to very simple victory for white. Black goes with king e5 followed by bishop a8. It's just not even worth it to try king f4, because after king c4, black can't even grab the pawn on g2, and clearly they will be very late even bring the king or knight into the action by any stretch, because white simply promotes the a pawn. So black goes with king d6, tries to stay there and control the pawn and playing g4. But right now what white does is that they push the pawn all the way to a5, and on a correct timing, they go with king b5, followed by king a6. It will be impossible to go for king c7. Well, it is an idea to protect the a7 pawn, but after king c7, it leads to king c5, and white wins the game on spot. So after king b5, knight goes to g8, bishop b1. Basically, a couple of moves were played, and it's just the game is over. This a7 pawn will be gone in a short order. White goes for bishop a2. Make sure that the c4 pawn will not have a lot of counterplay in the future. Grabbing the pawn, going for a6. It looks like this king is just stopping this king immediately, and there's not much to do. But after playing bishop e6, it becomes obvious that this knight is trapped, can't go anywhere. This is another example where we see that bishop completely dominates the weak knight on h6, which is standing at the edge of the board. And if c4, white will be happy to take it. And if king d6, which attacks the bishop, it is time to bring the bishop backwards on b6. King takes on e6, a7, and black resigned. If you like the Endgame series, definitely check out this playlist where you will see the pawn endgames, knight and bishop endgames as well.